Donkey Kong Country 3 has always been considered the black sheep of the original Donkey Kong Country trilogy, and funnily enough, the Game Boy Advance version is kind of in the same boat, not having many of the features that its predecessors have, but also having its own slew of unique features as well. This is Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance. Let's check it out. Right off the bat, the opening sequence shows off the Nautilus that was the location of the secret final boss of the original, opting for a big focus on water. The menus themselves are all underwater and feature the water rippling effect that the Donkey Kong Country games have. This is certainly an interesting choice. It makes the menus a bit hard to read at times, but I can't deny that it looks cool and it's pretty unique. This is a good time to bring up a major feature of this port too. Due to issues with recreating the original game's soundtrack, due to its abundance of low notes that the Game Boy Advance's hardware could not handle well, David Wise has created an entirely new soundtrack for the game, featuring several new songs and some remixes of his old content. The new soundtrack is really good actually, but suffers from a few big problems and oddities. First of all, there's a lot of instances of his music not really fitting the tone of the game, with the tree and snow level types in particular showing this off. You've got this happy tree climbing track playing while you're being forced to climb up a tree due to a saw blade chasing you up, and snow levels that attempt to be similar in feel to the snow levels of the first game, but instead of ambient snow music, you get yodeling instead. Like I said, the songs are pretty good, but they just feel like they were made in a vacuum or something, and not really made for the levels that they were intended for. The second major point to the soundtrack that sort of ties into the first point is that the soundtrack itself just feels unfinished. There are several instances of situations that lack unique tracks that existed in the original. For example, the main menu simply uses the Stilt Village theme instead of a unique menu theme. Even the final boss lacks a different song from other bosses, even though there are actually two other bosses in this port that do have a separate theme from the others. There isn't even any death tracks in this game. When you die, the music just keeps on playing. There's plenty of other examples, but you get my point. The soundtrack feels rushed. Anyways, the menus are more or less the same as Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance, though this game lacks any major side modes like score attack or a time trial mode. The game is similar to the original game and features a sound test mode as well. Some hints of this game mode being rushed actually exist in the sound test mode. One of the options early on in the sound test is different depending on what version of the game you have. Early versions call it Banana Bird Queen, with later versions simply calling it Jungle Ambience. In all versions of the game, the Banana Queen simply plays the Brothers Bear theme, so they were likely planning on giving her own theme like the original before running out of time, and just kinda forgot to change her entry in the sound test. The name change to Jungle Ambience is obviously fitting, but redundant because the song that plays is simply Jungle Jitters for the Game Boy Advance, which already exists in the sound test. Why they didn't simply remove this entry is something I don't know, but either way, it's a good example of this game very likely being rushed to completion. Other than that, most entities in this game have different sound effects, including the infamous kitty death cry, which is very ear-rending in this port. This game has its own slew of minigames as well. Funky has 4 boating minigames, each based on a different mechanic. Challenge 1 has you shooting down other boats. Challenge 2 involves grabbing mines from one side and bringing them back to the other side of the course to score a point. Challenge 3 reverses Challenge 2 and has you protecting conchs from being stolen away to an objective. And Challenge 4 has you racing to the end of the track against other boats. These games are actually remakes of Cobra Triangle, an old Rare game released for the NES. The music that plays during these games is also a remix of Rare's RC Pro-Am's theme, which is another game that they made for the NES. The song's actually one of the best songs in the game. Unfortunately, the games themselves are not particularly enjoyable. The controls are a lot like you'd expect boats to control, which is as bad as it sounds. The controls are loose, the camera is zoomed in a lot, especially for how fast you go, which results in you crashing into walls a lot. And because you have a health bar, you actually take damage from crashing into walls. The objectives themselves aren't really all that fun either. Challenge 1 is actually often considered by a lot of people to be the hardest, but to be honest, I didn't really find it that hard. You just kinda hold down the fire button and just try not to crash into walls and other boats, but the problem is that it's just boring. Challenge 2 is incredibly basic. You just go back and forth between 2 zones and score points. There's one enemy boat, but he struggles to ever touch you, and even if he does, if he touches you when you're king of mine, nothing happens. It doesn't matter. Challenge 1 is basically a mix of Challenge 1 and 2, and is probably the best of the 4 challenges, but that's not saying much. Challenge 4 is actually what I consider by far the hardest one. It's a race, But you'll find that the hardest part isn't winning the race, but just getting to the end without blowing up. It's extremely easy to get stuck between the other enemy boats and just lose tons of HP very quickly. The challenge is really difficult to beat. The only way I managed to beat challenge 4 was to just get lucky and have the crumbling bolts all get stuck in each other early on, and then I just had to kind of focus on not smashing into walls. You have to complete all 4 of these challenges to get a banana bird, and it just sucks. It's not fun. Swanky's game has been changed from the target range to a Sonic 2 style tunnel run. The game is pretty self-explanatory. You just run through a tunnel grabbing stars and avoiding the practically ripped straight out of Super Mario 64 mines. The controls are kind of slippery, but not too bad honestly. You have a jump, which can be difficult to use, but is usually required for the perfect score, and you also have a brake, but honestly, I never found the brake to be very useful because it just takes a while to brake. Each area of the world map has a new level to play, and each level has a score to beat as well. Beat the scores of every level to earn another banana bird. The game isn't that enjoyable to play, but it's at least a lot better than Funky's. Swanky himself uses his sprite from Donkey Kong Country 2 instead of the new one that they made for this game, which is actually complete with him staring off to the right despite the fact that the Kong is coming from the left. Who knows with this port, man. Finally, Cranky now hosts his own minigame to play as well. His is a simple game of blocking bristles from hitting him, which you do with a shield by just holding a direction. The controls here are simple, which proves to be for the best, because this minigame is easily the most fun to play. Once again, each area has a new sequence to play, although ironically, his game, despite being the most enjoyable, is only actually required to be beaten once to earn his banana bird. Overall though, the minigames here are all pretty subpar honestly. Compared to the previous port, they just aren't fun to play. Starting a new game shows that this game actually lacks an intro cutscene like its predecessors have, simply having the same jump into the water intro that the original game has, although this version makes you swim yourself. As with its predecessors again, the maps are redesigned, though because the original game already has pretty detailed maps, the redesigns aren't that different from the original. The level order is almost exactly the same. The only levels that were changed were Barrel Shield Bust Up and Springing Spiders. They simply swapped positions, likely due to Barrel Shield Bust Up being considered generally a harder level. Traversing the world map is pretty similar as well, though due to the zoomed in camera again, it once more takes a lot longer to traverse the submaps and the world map. This is actually more apparent in this version too, because for some reason the reusable exits at the end of certain worlds, namely Worlds 2, 5, and the Lost World, are no longer there, and the non-reusable ones are gone as well. When you beat a boss, it just puts you back on the world map. What's strange is that you may have noticed I didn't mention the exit in World 3, Cotton Top Cove, because for some reason it's still there. You can also use the waterfall in Chaos Core too. The lack of consistency is just another example of this game really just feeling rushed. These forgotten world exits even tie into the fact that the in-game menu is severely lacking in features. Pausing the game on the world map simply shows what items you have and lets you save and quit to the main menu. This means that despite previous ports utilizing their menus to show level stats and have fast travel and even show tips and tricks that you've gotten from Cranky and Wrinkly, this game just doesn't have that. You can argue that the original game didn't have these gameplay tips from Wrinkly or Cranky, but the save anywhere feature means that Wrinkly has no purpose in this game, so it would have been nice if they at least gave her something to do, and the lack of level stats is just yet another example of the rushed game. Because of her uselessness, all of Wrinkly's spots and submaps are replaced by Cranky's dojo. Speaking of which, despite both Game Boy Advance ports having this, and the freaking credits for Donkey Kong Country 3 being this port does not have a photo album. In fact, this port lacks any sort of character cast at all. Beating the final boss just gives you credits. Like, I keep saying it, but it just feels like this game was shipped out the door without having any extra time and effort that it really needed. It's lacking content that's been in every other game in the series. It's just so bizarre. Well, that's enough ragging on the game. On a more positive note, this port does in fact feature a completely brand new world called Pacifica. Pacifica is located in the pool of water in the northwestern part of the world that previously only contained K's cache, the Banana Bird cache. You can get to Pacifica when you unlock the Turbo Ski through the use of a new pathway on the far west of the map. Not only is Pacifica available at the same time that K3 is, but Razor Ridge is also now unlocked at the same time as well, which means that you can now play these 3 worlds in any order you wish, which is an excellent change in my opinion. It always seemed like it was intended that way to me, and having choice in world order is just a nice way to add a little bit more variety when you replay the game. Honestly, it just feels like Pacifica is where the devs put all their time and effort in this port. Some changes were made to accommodate this new world too. Barbos was moved to Pacifica, and a new boss called Croctopus was added to replace his spot in Razor Ridge. Secondly, Barnacle was moved to Pacifica, and a new Brothers Bear was added to Lake Orangatanga to replace him. And of course, the new world also contains a Banana Bird cave to find as well. Speaking of the Brothers Bear, they've all been completely redesigned, and their homes have been given unique designs as well. As for the quality of these redesigns, well, I don't think any of them are particularly bad per se, but they're not very creative to say the least. Barnacle, for example, goes from looking pretty akin to a retired sailor, looks more just like a stereotypical Navy captain in this port, complete with the hat and uniform, despite still saying that he's just a retired scuba diver. He doesn't even have his sweet looking mustache and eyebrows, which are like the best parts of his design. Barter lacks his sort of sleazy businessman look and cool mustache and just kinda looks like a fireman or something. He also doesn't change his look when you give him the mirror. Blizzard isn't a polar bear anymore, and Baffle is just a detective now instead of having his cool sort of pre-2000s programmer look to him. The original designs just seemed more unique and interesting, with most of the new designs being pretty typical video game stuff. Now that I'm saying this though, it's actually kind of funny how this is like a mirror of real life. The new designs are pretty cool if they were in real life, and the originals would be the boring ones. But because this is a video game, having these bears look like normal dudes instead of being kind of video gamey is pretty unique for a game that's released in 1996. And as a whole, this kinda sums up the entirety of Donkey Kong Country 3's visual design, being pretty typical of what you see in real life, but not really being what you see in a video game. Like, even the Kremlings kinda tie into this, being more standard reptilian-like than the pirate theme of the old game. Each bear having their own home design is cool, but also leads into some weird choices being made. Blue's home, for example, is now a full-blown birthday party, complete with presents, birthday cards, and a cake, which then makes you wonder how it's possible everyone forgot about his birthday if he's gotten presents from people. Brash now lives, quote-unquote, in a stadium, which is obviously more thematic, but doesn't really make sense as a home for him to live in. Obviously, while it's nice that these new designs are here, the designs themselves kind of miss the point of the original. Speaking of which, the new bear that I talked about is named Bachelor, who lives in a appropriately named bachelor pad, complete with a hot tub and everything. He has his own slew of new items for this port. When you visit him for the first time, he actually gives you that Pongus flower that Bramble wants in the original game right away, and you trade it with him to get a rose for Bachelor. You also need to buy chocolates from Bazaar for 20 coins. Then, with both in hand, you return to Bachelor and get a banana bird. Because of this sequence, you now get a banana bird from Bramble as soon as you complete Mechanos, instead of having to wait for Razor Ridge to be complete and to have already given the shell to Barnacle. It's pretty nice that they added this extra chocolate thing to buy too, because the original game only needs 65 coins, which is 50 for the mirror, 5 for the shell, and 10 to buy the mirror back from whoever you give it to first. Speaking of which, the number of banana birds is now 20 total, up from the original's 15, and the total number of DK coins in this port is 46, which is 5 more than the 41 of the original. A minor but missed detail is that the levels in Krematona no longer change their color palettes upon rising up the Nautilus. Instead, all of the levels simply already have the bright red hue to them, which is once again kind of a sign of lack of polish and time. Do I sound like a broken record yet? Auric and the new Croctopus boss use a new boss theme made for them. The song itself sounds pretty good actually, but like I mentioned earlier, why do these two bosses get their own song while K.Rool just gets the normal boss fight theme? I'm gonna turn into a parrot at this rate. Another minor detail is that the background of Belcha's barn used to be the same as in factory levels, but was changed to just be the standard mill background. I prefer the more menacing background the original had, given the context of the situation, but I can at least forgive them for this since it's at least consistent with other levels. What about the endings? Well, like I've mentioned, there's no cast of characters upon being the Baron for the first time, which is pretty lame, and the 100% ending is just as bad. The lack of unique music for the Queen hampers the experience. The chase itself is short and lacks any real intensity. Every part of the endings in this game is just entirely inferior to the original, and considering the ending for Donkey Kong Country 3 wasn't exactly as great as Donkey Kong Country 2, this really stands out. As for things like quality of life changes, besides saving anywhere like in all the other ports, defeating coin now automatically gives you DK coin instead of having to collect it, which is in the same vein as Donkey Kong Land 3. And that's it. There's no quick world exit feature or anything else added. Once again, I must state that this game is really lacking in features that its predecessors had. Otherwise, the only other changes of note are the normal standardizations that all the other ports had. Large unchanging hitboxes, large blast barrels that thankfully don't have lag in this port, and bonus barrels always warp you instead of shooting you, and so on. Finally, let's talk about the gameplay and physics. First off, let's go over the bosses. Changes made to the bosses are kinda all over the place for some reason. Belcha has an added grinder in the back of his arena, but it doesn't really change how the fight works in any sort of meaningful way. Auric has the new boss song that I mentioned, but is otherwise pretty much the same other than the standard minor differences in timing. Squirt is a whole nother story though. His water squirting patterns are almost completely different, and he is a significantly more difficult fight. He is faster and has parts where he squirts multiple bursts of water at the same time. I guess after how easy he was in the original, they tried to up the ante. Though I will say that a large part of the added difficulty comes from the slippery controls that these ports are known for having. Chaos is once again basically the same. The only notable difference is that the final Maskless always has 3 shots to fire instead of having 4 in the second part in the original. K3's Bleak is changed in a minor but kinda crazy way. The pauses between different phases of his fight are actually gone, resulting in there being no time to breathe between his phases. He'll shoot snowballs at you and then instantly start blasting you with more groups of them. It's definitely harder, but kind of annoying too. Other than that, you don't need to change your aim when he's in the background, and he shoots an extra snowball during the first barrage of the snow. The new boss, Croctopus, is very strange in my opinion. He has 3 phases, with each phase becoming a little bit faster than the previous one, and each of these phases consists of 2 parts. First, he'll lunge at 4 predetermined locations, and then he'll actively start targeting you. It's during his active attack part that random cartoony bombs will appear in the area, and if he hits a bomb 3 times, he'll submerge and re-emerge to start the next phase. Each phase has the bomb lasting for 1 less attack, and he'll attack 2 places at the same time in the final phase. While I appreciate that the boss has platforming in it, the whole fight is just so arbitrary and strange that I really wonder what they were thinking when they made it. The cartoony bombs just really feel out of place in a game like this. Like, it's funny to say because people say that this game has a cartoony art style, but the bombs are very different looking from everything else. It's not bad per se, but it's just not that particularly interesting. Not to mention that Dixie has a massive advantage over Kitty here, because the bomb explosion actually hurts you. Which means that Dixie can just hover in place, but Kitty has to actually engage in avoiding the boss's attacks. Barbos is exactly the same, other than the usual minor differences in timing. Finally, both K.Rool fights are mostly the same, with the only major difference being that the final phases of both fights only require 2 hits instead of the increased 3 that the original game had. As for level differences, most levels are pretty much the same, other than the obvious difference in physics. There are some changes here and there, like Crisscross Cliffs now has the steel gates hurting you if you touch them from the side, and you can't skip the buzzers anymore. Other minor differences include a lot of items being changed to being visible and vice versa. These item changes are pretty random though, so it's likely that these aren't intentional changes and are just artifacts for the fact that the game is built from the ground up. There are some oversights due to the different scale and physics though. For example, the bonus in Tidal Trouble that normally requires a Kitty water skip or a well-timed glide from Dixie can be gotten by simply jumping up to it in this port, a feat that makes the bonus obviously very trivial to reach. There are also a few minor structural changes, mainly an area which require Kitty's team throw, as the team throw in this game is actually massively nerfed. Kitty throws Dixie barely higher than he can jump, so a few spots had to actually be lowered or changed to accommodate this. Most notably, the coin spot in Springing Spiders had to be completely reworked. The TNT barrel is on the other side of the wall because you can't actually reach the spot with team throw anymore. I'm not sure why it was nerfed so much, to be honest. If it was just a little bit higher of a throw, nothing would have had to have been changed. It just feels like they nerfed something that wasn't broken to begin with. The one level that was completely overhauled is Rocket Rush. First things first, the controls aren't inverted anymore. Second, red buzzes can't be killed with a rocket, but green ones that have been added to the level can. Third, you can be hurt while in the rocket by buzzes. Fourth, pressing up affects the main engine instead of the nozzles. Fifth and final, the midpoint is completely removed. These changes in mechanics, complete with a completely changed layout of buzzes and fuel, result in a completely different level despite using the exact same geometry. While in the original game the descent is easy and the ascent is hard, this port flips the difficulty, with the descent requiring a lot of precision movement and the ascent being mostly trivial due to the added fuel barrels. As for the controls aspect, I've already mentioned that the team throw is nerfed and the slippery physics. There's also changed interaction with rolling into foes, where, bizarrely, you do not speed up when you hit an enemy in this port until you've rolled into a second enemy. Why this change was made is anyone's guess. The slippery controls in this port are especially bad because of the Castle Chaos fight, which involves jumping around on those small platforms. Accurately landing on these is very difficult because the Kongs constantly slide around, but also because you can't even properly turn around, because just like in Donkey Kong Land, you turn around and it just snaps you to the other direction instead of slowing you down. Trust me, it don't feel good. The animals in this port control more or less the same as the previous port. Ellie inherits her controls from Rambi and is pretty much the same as the original. There is one really weird quirk with Ellie though. When she's picking up a barrel, the barrel actually has physical collision with the geometry, meaning that the barrel will make you unable to get close to walls, and will actually break if you drop off a ledge too close to a wall. It's a really strange interaction, but it's even stranger that they even bothered making this interaction to begin with, because it's not like Ellie ever interacts with barrels and walls walls all that often. It just makes jumping around walls a little awkward. The controls for swimming are also pretty much the same as the previous port, i.e. they still suck. They're similar to the originals but just aren't as polished. Holding down is still fine, but holding up results in you moving very far upward due to the higher vertical movement in these ports. And unlike something like, say, Super Mario World, you can't stop your movement at all once you've inputted the buttons. This, mixed with a smaller camera, results in lots of hits and being unable to see all that much above you. What isn't similar to the past games are the toboggan controls. The toboggan is slow, but jumps incredibly high in this port, even off of enemies. Which, once again, mixed with the small camera, results in very strange interactions, where you'll end up getting hit by jumping before you can even see a buzz and then just kind of flying into it. It's not terrible, but it makes levels very difficult if you haven't memorized them. All in all, this port has a lot of flaws that make it kind of a poor substitute for the original game. Basically, if you want to play this port, you play it for Pacifica, because the levels in Pacifica are actually quite well designed for the most part. At least the first half is. The second half, well, I'll be posting another video that shows me playing through Pacifica, and trust me, you'll see me complaining about the last 2 levels. I don't know why this port is the way it is, but let it be known that nobody wins when a game is rushed out the door.